In Kumasi, where tradition and modern life mix so easily, Kwame was a man people looked up to. He was a respected businessman, known for his sharp suits, polished cars, and the confidence that seemed to follow him everywhere. Neighbors greeted him with admiration, and in business circles his name carried weight. To many, Kwame was proof that success could be achieved with discipline and hard work. Beside him was Adjoa, his beautiful wife, who carried herself with elegance wherever she went. At gatherings, she turned heads with her grace, her calm smile, and her quiet presence. People often whispered about how lucky she was, married to such a powerful man, living in a home that symbolized wealth and stability. Together, Kwame and Adjoa were seen as the ideal couple, the kind others wanted to copy. But behind the polished smiles and picture-perfect image, Adjoa carried a heaviness no one else could see. Kwame's love, though real in his own way, often came with control. He liked decisions to be his alone, from what food was served at their table to how Adjoa should dress in public. To him, it was his duty as a husband to lead. To her, it sometimes felt like living in a cage made of gold. Friends admired her calm demeanor, never guessing that beneath her quiet smile was a woman wrestling with silent frustrations. She wanted more than admiration. She wanted freedom to be heard, to be seen as more than just Kwame's wife. At parties and community gatherings in Kumasi, Kwame always made sure everyone noticed him. He liked to speak the loudest, laugh the hardest, and carry himself as if he owned every room he entered. People clapped for his speeches and nodded along when he talked about business or life, but what many failed to see was how little space he left for anyone else, especially Adjoa. When she tried to join conversations, Kwame would brush her words aside with a quick joke or change of subject. To him, she was there to stand by his side and make him look complete, not to have a voice of her own. Adjoa played her role well. She dressed in fine clothes, smiled when people praised their marriage, and posed gracefully when friends admired them as the perfect couple. But inside, she felt more like an ornament than a partner. Every time her ideas were dismissed or her opinions silenced, a small part of her spirit dimmed. She began to wonder if anyone really saw her at all, beyond the image of being Kwame's beautiful wife. It was not that Kwame was cruel in public. In fact, he showered her with compliments in front of others, but his words often sounded like he was displaying a prized possession rather than honoring a woman he loved. "My wife," he would boast, "is the finest jewel in Kumasi." People clapped, but Adjoa's smile never reached her eyes. She felt trapped between the admiration of strangers and the emptiness growing inside her. Her closest friends started to notice. At weddings, funerals, and naming ceremonies, they whispered among themselves, watching the way she carried her smile like a mask. "She looks happy," one friend murmured, "but her eyes are sad." Another replied, "Maybe she hides too much. A woman can't live only for appearances." Those words echoed in Adjoa's mind long after the parties ended. At night, when the house was quiet and Kwame was asleep, she lay awake asking herself questions she never dared to say out loud. Who was she without Kwame's name? Did she matter beyond her role as his wife? Was this the life she had dreamed of when she was younger, full of hope and ambition? The more she thought about it, the more her heart ached. She wanted love that listened, respect that valued her voice, and a life where she could breathe without fear of being overshadowed. Yet every morning, she put on her elegant clothes, fixed her smile, and played her part once again. To the outside world, she was still the queen beside the king. But deep inside, cracks were forming in the perfect picture. And though no one could see it clearly yet, Adjoa herself knew the truth. Something in her life was breaking, and soon, it could no longer be hidden. The dining table was full that evening, laughter bouncing from wall to wall as Kwame's family enjoyed the rich meal before. Platters of jollof rice, grilled chicken, and garden egg stew filled the air with a comforting aroma. Kwame sat proudly at the head of the table, his voice dominating the conversation as usual, telling stories of his latest business deals and joking loudly while everyone listened. Adjoa, as always, sat quietly beside him, smiling politely when someone glanced her way. To the family, everything seemed normal. No one could imagine what was about to happen. In the middle of the chatter, Adjoa placed her fork gently on her plate. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure it could be heard above the laughter. For years she had kept her silence, swallowing her frustrations, playing the perfect wife. But that night, something inside her refused to stay quiet. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and with a calm but steady voice, she said words that silenced the entire room. "I am leaving," she said. The laughter stopped instantly. Heads turned. Forks froze in midair. It was as though the air itself had been stolen from them. Someone coughed in disbelief. Another gasped loudly. All eyes darted to Kwame, waiting for him to laugh it off as a joke. But Adjoa's face was serious, her eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. Kwame's voice cracked through the silence, sharp and defensive. "What nonsense are you saying, Adjoa? In front of my family?" But Adjoa did not shrink. She had spent too many years shrinking. Her voice grew firmer as she spoke again, this time louder, so that no one could mistake her meaning. "I'd rather live free in poverty than rich in chains." The words cut through the room like a blade. Some of the women gasped again. An elderly uncle shook his head in disbelief. A cousin whispered, "Did she really just say that?" Kwame's face turned red with anger and shame. He looked around the table, seeing the shock in his relatives' eyes, feeling their judgment heavy on his shoulders. For a man who thrived on respect and admiration, this was the worst humiliation. His pride, his reputation, his control, all of it had been challenged right in front of the very people whose opinions mattered most to him. Adjoa did not flinch. She pushed her chair back slowly, the scrape of wood against the floor sounding louder than any voice in that moment. She stood tall, her calmness even more powerful than Kwame's rage. For years, she had been treated like a prize to display, but that night she became something else entirely, a woman choosing her own freedom. No one tried to stop her. Perhaps they were too shocked, or perhaps they saw in her eyes that nothing could change her mind. As she walked away from the table, leaving behind the food, the chatter, and the life she once knew, the family sat frozen in silence. Kwame stared at her retreating figure, his chest tight with anger, humiliation, and a fear he would never admit aloud. That dinner was supposed to be another display of his power. Instead, it became the night his empire began to crumble. News of Adjoa's bold decisions spread faster than Kwame ever imagined. It slipped out of the family dinner, leaked into whispers between relatives, and by the next morning it was carried into the streets of Kumasi like smoke from a burning house. Markets buzzed with the story. At the butcher's stall, women shook their heads in disbelief. At the fabric shops, traders laughed behind their hands. In churches, it became prayer gossip. "Let's pray for Kwame and his wife," they said, though their voices carried more curiosity than compassion. His closest friends, the same men who once cheered his every move, were the loudest in their laughter. At drinking spots, they slapped tables and roared. "How can a man of his power lose to his wife?" one mocked, his words followed by a wave of chuckles. Kwame, the mighty businessman, brought down not by rivals, not by poverty, but by his own woman, another added. "If he cannot control his home, how can he control his business?" The men laughed even harder, their voices echoing into the night. Kwame heard the whispers everywhere he went. He walked through the markets with his head high, pretending not to notice, but the murmurs stung like thorns. Women carrying baskets of tomatoes glanced at him, and then at each other, their knowing eyes sharper than men who once rushed to shake his hand now greeted him with half-hearted nods, their smirks betraying the respect that had slipped away. Even children, overhearing adults, teased one another in the streets. "Don't be like Kwame, oh!" What cut him deepest was the betrayal of his friends. These were men he had shared drinks with, men who had leaned on his success, men who once bowed to his confidence. Now they turned his pain into entertainment, mocking him in small corners, their voices dripping with amusement. Some even told the story in exaggerated detail, acting it out as though it were a comedy. How Adjoa stood, how she declared her freedom, how Kwame's face twisted with anger. Laughter followed each retelling, tearing at the image he had built over years. Reputation was everything in Kumasi, and Kwame knew it. Respect was the currency that fueled his business, his influence, his standing in the community. Without it, he was nothing. And now that reputation was crumbling like a wall struck by rain. Investors began to hesitate, questioning his stability. Church elders whispered, "Perhaps he is not the strong leader we thought he was." At home, Kwame felt the silence closing in. His phone still rang, but the calls were fewer, and most came with hidden sneers. Every time he stepped outside, he felt eyes following him, waiting to see how the once mighty man would stumble next. The humiliation burned hotter than fire, but his pride would not let him admit defeat. Instead, he clenched his jaw, drank more, and told himself that somehow he would rise again. But the truth was clear. His fall had already begun, and the laughter of his friends was only the first crack in the empire he thought was unshakable. Kwame had always believed his name was untouchable. For years, doors opened when he knocked. Investors trusted his word without hesitation, and business partners competed to sit at his table. But after Adjoa's dramatic exit, something shifted. The same people who once admired his confidence now looked at him with doubt. Whispers followed him into boardrooms, and jokes about his broken marriage crept into serious discussions. At first, the changes were small. A client postponed a meeting. A supplier delayed a delivery. Kwame brushed it off, telling himself it was coincidence. But soon the pattern became too clear to ignore. A major investor who had promised to fund one of his new projects suddenly pulled out, explaining politely that circumstances have changed. Another potential partner excused himself, saying he needed to think about the risks. Kwame could hear the unspoken words. If he couldn't control his home, how could he control his business? Kumasi was a city that thrived on reputation, and Kwame's was slipping like water through his hand. He still walked with his head high, his suits pressed sharp as always, but inside he was boiling. Every failed deal felt like an insult, every whisper like a dagger. He told himself it was envy, that people were jealous of his success, but deep down he knew the truth. His pride and his humiliation had become his undoing. Instead of softening his heart, Kwame's arrogance grew. He snapped at employees, dismissed advice, and argued with partners who tried to steady him. People who once respected him began to drift away quietly, choosing to protect their own names rather than be dragged down with his sinking ship. Even old friends avoided his calls, not wanting to be associated with the man who had become the center of gossip and ridicule. At night, Kwame found comfort at the bottom of a bottle. He drank heavily, trying to drown the echo of Adjoa's words. "I'd rather live free in poverty than rich in chains." He replayed that dinner scene in his mind again and again, each time feeling the sting of shame more sharply. But his pride refused to let him admit fault. Apologizing to Adjoa, or even showing remorse, would mean admitting weakness, and that was something Kwame could not do. The more he drank, the more reckless he became. Meetings were missed. Promises were broken. His once perfect image of discipline and control cracked wide open. Businessmen whispered, "He is no longer reliable," and investors backed away completely. Kwame's empire, once built so carefully, began to collapse one stone at a time. He told himself he could still fix it, that one big deal would restore everything. But the truth was cruel. Without respect, without trust, there was no empire left to save. Alone in his mansion, glass in hand, Kwame stared at the walls that once symbolized victory. Now they felt like a prison, closing in tighter with every passing day. His downfall had begun, and for the first time in his life, he had no idea how to stop it. When Adjoa left Kumasi, she carried very little with her. A small suitcase, a few dresses, and just enough money to survive a few weeks. She didn't even know where she would sleep at first, but she knew she had to get out. Accra was far enough away to feel like a new beginning. The city was busy, noisy, and full of strangers, yet to Adjoa, it felt like freedom. For the first time in years, she breathed without fear of someone watching her every move. Life was not easy. She rented a tiny room on the outskirts of the city, nothing like the mansion she once lived in. She cooked simple meals, sometimes stretching one plate of wache across 2 days. But even in those struggles, she felt a lightness she had never known in Kumasi. Poverty did not scare her. Chains did, and she had already broken hers. One day, while sitting in the shade of a small shop, Adjoa overheard young girls talking. They were laughing about marriage, about finding a rich husband who could take care of them. Their words pierced her heart. She had lived that dream, and she knew how it ended. That night she could not sleep, her mind circling around one thought. What if I could teach them what I never knew? What if I could show them that their worth is more than a man's approval? She started small. She gathered a few girls from the neighborhood and shared her story. Not the full details, but enough for them to understand the dangers of depending only on someone else's power. She taught them simple lessons about self-worth, independence, and how to dream for themselves. At first, the girls were shy, but soon they began to listen, to ask questions, and to return with their friends. Word spread quickly. Mothers began encouraging their daughters to attend. A local church offered her a small hall for free. What began as a casual talk under a tree grew into weekly workshops where girls laughed, learned, and left with fire in their eyes. Adjoa taught them skills, how to read contracts, how to budget, how to speak with confidence. But more than skills, she gave them something deeper, the courage to believe in themselves. People in Accra started to notice her work. Women admired her bravery, calling her a symbol of strength. Some whispered about her past, about the rich husband she had walked away from. But instead of pity, they offered respect. She left wealth to find her voice, they said. And now she is teaching others to do the same. Every time Adjoa stood in front of those young girls, she felt her pain transform into purpose. The wounds from her marriage became lessons that lifted others. The silence she once carried turned into a voice that spoke for women who were still afraid. And in the laughter and determination of the girls she taught, she saw hope for a different future, one where no woman would ever again be seen as just a trophy. Adjoa had lost almost everything when she walked away. But in Accra, she found something greater than wealth. She found herself. And in doing so, she became a voice for countless women who longed to be free. Kwame's fall was slow at first, but when it came like a storm that ripped everything apart. The mansion that once stood proudly on the hills of Kumasi was the first to go. He could no longer keep up with the debts piling on him, and soon the house was sold off to cover his losses. The cars, too, the sleek black Mercedes, the shiny Lexus, even the old Land Cruiser he had kept as a symbol of his early success, were all taken one by one. The man who once drove through town with heads turning now walked quietly, trying not to be noticed. His so-called loyal friends vanished just as quickly as his wealth. These were the men who used to laugh the loudest at his jokes, who ate and drank at his table, who once called him boss. Now they no longer answered his calls. If they saw him from afar, they crossed the street or ducked into shops to avoid him. The same mouths that had mocked him before were now sealed with silence, not out of respect, but because they wanted nothing to do with a man who had fallen so low. Everywhere Kwame went, he felt the emptiness of abandonment. The respect, the admiration, the envy that once surrounded his name had evaporated. People spoke about him as if he were a story, not a man. "Do you remember Kwame?" they said. "The one who lost everything when his wife left." His identity was no longer tied to his business, his power, or his wealth. It was tied to his shame. Most nights, Kwame ended up at a small bar in town. He chose the darkest corner, where the music was loud enough to cover his thoughts, but not enough to drown his pain. A bottle always sat in front of him, sometimes two. He drank until his vision blurred, until the memory of Adjoa's voice, "I'd rather live free in poverty than rich in chains," faded into the fog of alcohol. But no matter how much he drank, the truth returned each morning with the cruel light of day. One evening, as he stared into his glass, the weight of it all crashed down on him. The empire he had built with pride was gone, not because of enemies, not because of poverty, but because of his own stubbornness. One decision, the way he treated his wife, the way he held on to control instead of love, had shattered everything. He had lost her, and in losing her, he had lost himself. Kwame no longer looked like the powerful man he once was. His suits hung loosely on his frame, his eyes carried dark circles, and his shoulders slumped under the weight of regret. He was a shadow of the man people once admired. The man who had lived for pride and respect now had neither. Alone in that bar, with no friends, no family, and no empire, Kwame finally saw what he had become. Just another broken man in the corner, clutching a bottle, haunted by the ghost of the life he had destroyed. The night of the ceremony in Accra felt like a dream to Adjoa. The hall was filled with women and men from across Ghana, leaders, activists, students, and families, all gathered to celebrate those who had made a difference in the lives of women. The lights were bright, the air alive with excitement, and Adjoa sat quietly among the guests until her name was called. When the announcer said, "Tonight, we honor Adjoa for her courage and her work in empowering young girls," the room erupted in applause. She walked to the stage slowly, but each step carried a strength that years ago she never imagined she could have. She was no longer the quiet wife sitting beside a man's shadow. She was a woman who had built her own voice, her own name. The spotlight fell on her, and for the first time in her life, it did not feel heavy. It felt right. Adjoa's dress was simple but elegant, her smile calm yet powerful. When she reached the podium, she paused for a moment, looking at the faces in the crowd. She saw young girls she had taught sitting in the front row, their eyes wide with admiration. She saw mothers who had once whispered their gratitude, and women who had once doubted themselves now standing tall. The sight filled her chest with emotion, but her voice was steady as she began to speak. "Sometimes," she said, her words carrying through the hall, "destruction is the path to true freedom." The room fell silent, listening closely. "When I walked away from my old life, people thought I was foolish. They thought I had thrown away wealth and comfort. But what they did not see were the chains I lived under. I was not free. I was admired, but I was not heard. I was loved, but I was not respected. And so, I chose to lose everything in order to find myself." Her voice grew stronger. "I stand here today not because I was brave every day, but because I refused to stay silent. I refused to accept that a woman's worth is only in her husband's name. And I tell every young girl here, your voice matters, your dreams matter, your freedom matters. Never let anyone convince you otherwise." Tears filled many eyes in the audience. Some women clapped through their sobs, others stood, moved by her honesty. The applause grew louder, rolling through the hall like thunder. People chanted her name, celebrating not just her work, but her courage to break free and create something new from her pain. That night, Adjoa became more than just a teacher or mentor. She became a symbol of hope. Her story, once whispered with curiosity, now spread across Ghana as an anthem of strength. Young women in villages, towns, and cities began to say, "If Adjoa could walk away and still rise, so can I." On that stage, glowing under the lights, Adjoa realized she had not only rebuilt her life, she had sparked a movement. Her destruction had indeed led to freedom, not just for herself, but for countless women who now dared to dream of the same. Kwame almost didn't go. He had heard whispers that Adjoa was being honored in Accra, but the thought of facing that truth twisted his stomach. Yet something inside him refused to stay away. That night, dressed in a worn shirt and trousers that no longer carried the shine of his former life, he slipped quietly into the back of the hall. He hoped no one would notice him. He stood near the shadows, far from the bright lights and the decorated tables, watching from a distance. On stage, Adjoa stood tall, glowing in a way he had never seen when she was with him. The crowd clapped and cheered her name, their voices filling the room like music. Kwame's chest tightened as he realized they weren't clapping for Kwame's wife anymore. They were clapping for Adjoa, a woman who had built her own strength, her own path, her own story. He could not stop staring at her. Every word she spoke cut into him, not because she attacked him, she didn't even mention his name, but because he could see what he had destroyed. The woman he had once silenced was now speaking to hundreds, and they were hanging on to every word. The wife he had once treated as a trophy was now a leader, admired and loved by many. Kwame's eyes blurred with tears, though he fought to blink them away. Memories came flooding back. The dinner where she walked out, the arguments where he shut her down, the nights he thought his wealth was enough to keep her close. He had been so sure of his power, so certain that she could never survive without him. Yet here she was, shining brighter than ever, while he stood in the shadows, broken and forgotten. What cut even deeper was the sight of his old friends. The same men who had laughed at him, who had mocked him for losing his wife, were now sitting in the audience, clapping and cheering loudly for her. They leaned forward with admiration, their faces glowing with respect. Kwame lowered his head, his shame pressing down on him like a heavy weight. He realized that the respect he had once demanded could not compare to the genuine love she now received. For the first time in his life, Kwame felt truly powerless. It was not the loss of money or business that crushed him. It was the loss of her, and the knowledge that he had been the one to push her away. He wiped his face quickly, not wanting anyone to see his tears, but inside he was breaking. As the audience rose to give her a standing ovation, Kwame stayed still in the back, hidden in the shadows. He clapped softly, almost to himself, the sound swallowed by the roar of the crowd. In that moment, he knew he could never win her back, never undo the pain he had caused. All he could do was watch, heart heavy, as the woman he once controlled became the woman the world now celebrated. As the applause filled the hall, Adjoa glanced toward the back, almost by instinct. Her eyes searched through the crowd until they found him, Kwame, standing quietly in the shadows. For a moment, the noise of the room seemed to fade. It was just the two of them, locked in a silent exchange that carried years of love, pain, pride, and regret. There was no anger in her eyes, no hatred. Only a calm silence, as if she had already made peace with everything. Kwame, on the other hand, struggled to breathe. His chest ached, his eyes glistened, and for the first time he could not hide behind pride. He saw the distance between them clearly now, a distance no wealth, no apology, no promise could ever close. Adjoa gave a faint nod, almost like a farewell, before turning back to the crowd that cheered her name. Kwame lowered his head. He knew then that she belonged to a different world now, a world he had no place in. Quietly, he slipped out of the hall. The night air was cool, but it did nothing to ease the fire of regret burning inside him. He walked alone through the streets, no mansion to return to, no friends waiting, no wife by his side. The man who once held everything now had nothing, except the weight of what he had lost. And as Adjoa stood under the bright lights, her voice echoing with strength, Kwame faded into the darkness, broken and forgotten. One decision can destroy, but sometimes destruction is the only way to rebuild.